with programming languages. This is part 2 of the video presentation that we're doing. So again, we're going to talk difference between procedural, event-driven, and object-oriented languages and what they are. Very, very high level, of course, right? So let's look at some examples of procedural languages. So there's COBOL, and I'm sure you guys have to learn COBOL, don't you? In the course? No?
Well, I wouldn't say learned, but we were.
We learned the theory.
You're introduced to COBOL, right? That's what I'm getting. Right? But COBOL is an old language that should be dead right now. Actually, I'd like it to be dead, right? But that's just me. But it's still being used everywhere, and it's procedural. Fortran, I'm not going to say much about that. Basic. Actually, I learned how to program computers when I was using BASIC when I was 10, right? Way back in those days where I actually didn't have gray hair. But VB, or BASIC, the way it was called, wasn't VB anymore. It was BASIC. Like we're talking about line numbers where you use go-tos, right? That's what we're talking about back in the day. Those are procedural type of languages. They're, they kind of go A, B, C in terms of sequence. They don't really have procedures, so to speak, so much. They just follow a sequence of operations, command lines, one after the other, until they're done. Actually, in many ways, assembly. And I don't know if you guys have heard about assembly. If you haven't heard about it, you should. Again, it's one of those. Assembly language, of course, is very powerful, right? If you can write in assembly, and it's also procedural, or it's driven that way, right? One after the other. Now we're talking about event-driven. Event-driven is more of what we're normally doing. Okay, most people, honestly, know this stuff. They know event-driven programming. They don't understand object-oriented programming because it's too complex. Right? So event-driven programming is, again, VB6 and before. And I put in there C because C is really event-driven. It's not object-oriented. When we get into C++ and C#, Java, Objective-C, all that stuff, that's where it becomes object-oriented. And the great advantage to that is you can create a blueprint for your objects and reuse them. Right? Python is another object-oriented programming language. Do you have to use C#, object-oriented? No, you don't have to. You can actually use it procedurally, or you can use it in an event-driven fashion, right? I don't recommend it. I think that's like saying, I want to drive my Porsche, right? But I don't want to use the stick shift, right? I just want to drive on first gear all the time, right? I don't understand that. Or second, let's say I can get it into second, but after second, I don't want to go faster. That's just, I think it's, from a rapid application perspective, you need to understand object-oriented programming. From a design perspective, you could reuse some of the objects that are out there, and it helps you develop a code that is robust and that can be shared with other users, other programmers. Okay, so let's take a look at the object models. Very high level. It says VB. I got to change that. See what happens? I make a change to the structure, and it says VB instead of C#. And I'm going to miss that, guys, sometimes because we're converting again from VB to C#. Some of the stuff is exactly the same. Some of it's completely different. In C#, you'll work with objects that have properties, methods, and events. It's true. And what are they? Well, objects. And again, this is kind of an analogy here in terms of the way we speak. Objects are equate to nouns. Forms are windows. Controls are components contained inside a form. Properties are adjectives. Properties are also sometimes called, there's actually properties, but they're different names. Depending on the environment you're working within, object-oriented programming carries along with it different words and everything else. It means the same thing. So I'm going to try and give you some of the same words and say, well, in other languages, this is called this. Instead of a property, it's called a field, as an example, right? Methods are like verbs. They do stuff. So you have objects. The objects themselves are defined inside of a class, right? The class is the blueprint. The class has properties, or it could have variables, if you will, that contain information. So class variables, right? Fields in other languages, properties. Call them what you want. They're all the same. Methods are the functions of a class that are contained inside of a class. We just call them methods because they're in a class, right? At the end of the day, the methods and the functions, they do stuff for the class. They, and we'll talk about the types of stuff that they do. In this case, close, they do show, they do a clear method, and it does stuff. It modifies class properties or object properties, if you will. All right. And let's go actually click to the next level. All right. Events occur when the user takes an action, right? So for example, whether you're doing JavaScript or whether you're doing C#, you have an event that happens, it fires. We're going to use that terminology. The event's going to fire, right? And we're going to listen for the event. You can hear that event listener or event handler in other languages. Here we're calling them event procedures, right? Just different terminology. So if you hear the Microsoft event procedures, that's what they mean. Event listeners, event handlers. Okay? And all we're doing is we're listening for an event to fire. And there's standard events that happen that we are capable of listening to. And then we respond. We create a response in terms of a procedure in that line to an event that occurs. For example, we click. That's a click event. We listen for the click event, and we respond to it with an event procedure. Okay. Classes. We talked about classes being templates, blueprints, and so on. So I'm not going to go too much more into that. Okay, so here's the object model analogy. By the way, there's many of them. This is just one. We're using a car as an example as opposed to a cookie. You're going to hear a million analogies for the object model. At the end of the day, think about. I like to think about the object model as instead of an automobile as a blueprint. And I think the house is more of it's a better way of thinking about it. I want to build a house. I'm going to create a blueprint. I'm going to draft out a blueprint for my house. I haven't built it yet. I'm just drafting out the blueprint. The house is going to have a foundation. It's going to have the envelope. It's going to have the bricks. It's going to have some kind of electrical system, right, and so on. It's going to have different components, and all of these things are going to be inside the blueprint for my house. My house, again, if I make it generic enough, will be the blueprint of all the blueprints, right? If I want to make another house, it's still going to have an envelope. It's still going to have a foundation. It's still going to have a roof. It's still going to have all the same components of my standard house, but I want to make my house a little different, so I'm going to subclass it. I'm going to create another blueprint based on my previous blueprint of the generic house that I'm creating and create a house that's more specific for me. So it's not just a red house. It's not a red house, blue house kind of thing. It's like my house maybe is 26 by 26 feet, but I want to make a house that's doesn't have a second floor. So I'm creating a second blueprint based on my previous blueprint. Right? I'm modifying the design pattern that I've created. And the design pattern that I have in existence is helping me to create the next object. I haven't instantiated anything. Instantiating is like, I don't know, I'm a Trekkie. You know, when you have like in the olden days, or the old series, and none of you guys have seen this probably, but the old series, you can actually replicate food, right? The captain of the Enterprise would go there and press the button, and all of a sudden, food would come out of this replicator. It wouldn't be real food, right? People complain about it on the Starship. They'd say it's replicated, right? Well, instantiating in some ways is like replicating, right? We take the design pattern, the blueprint, and also when we instantiate, press the button, poof, the object comes into existence, right? That's a very big generalization because there's all kinds of stuff going on with it. There's memory management. There's all kinds of stuff going on with in the background. But we're programming in C#. We're not doing C++. There is no garbage collection we have to worry about. So when we instantiate an object, it's like poof, the object is in existence. We replicate that object by pressing a button equivalently. All right, so it's the same thing. When we talk about an automobile, or in this particular analogy, the automobile, there's a make, a model, a color, an engine, a year. All these things are properties, right? And then each object itself, when we instantiate the object, poof, press the button, and the automobile is created. The car is made, right? It actually has all the properties we defined. Methods that we access that are part of my design pattern, my blueprint, right, are the start, the stop, the speed up, the slow down. And then events we're listening for, well, what happens if my automobile crashes? What do I do? Do I create a sound? Does it crumple? What happens? These are the events we listen for. All right. Visual Studio 2012. So there's a bunch of stuff included in Visual Studio 2012. One of them is C#, Visual C++, which I recommend highly. If you're going to learn a great language, Visual C++ is the way to go. I think learning C++ in Visual Studio is easy. There's lots of tutorials out there on the internet, YouTube and so on, to learn Visual C++, but it's not rapid. Okay, and that's why we're not doing it, like I said. Visual Basic, again, if you can also be purchased separately if you really want to buy it separately. And F#, we're not going to talk about F#, but the .NET 4.5 framework is what we use with 2012. Okay, just let you know, it's not 4 or 3.5 or whatever, it's 4.5, and sometimes when we package an application together, you need to have that 4.5, .NET 4.5 framework in order for your application to work. We'll talk about packaging an application later on, of course. Okay, well, there's different editions. Visual Studio.NET includes Ultimate with MSDN, Premium with MSDN, and so on. There's different costs for it all. I believe if you don't have, if you haven't got it yet, you can get it through MSDN&A. It's available to you free as a student of Georgian. So you can go up online if you don't know where to get it, and you can get a free copy of Visual Studio for your own machine if you want. Okay? There's other ways of getting it too, but we're not going to talk about them. Right? Okay, moving on. So there's different versions of it. I'm using Ultimate, just to let you know. Okay. So the first part about writing C-style or C# projects, and actually VB projects in general, is the planning parts. Okay, and part of your assignments, we talked about assignments this morning, is there's going to be a piece of it that you're going to be planning. Now, in other places, you might learn something like pseudocode, right? Like this is we're talking about what the design is going to do without actually programming anything, right? This is a good practice. The other thing I'd like you to note is, and part of the requirements that I have is, hey, I want you to do a wireframe, right? And you might say, well, Tom, I'm really crap at doing wireframes. How do I do that, right? I don't care how you do it, actually. I think there's some really cool tools out there. And I will, at this stage, because we're talking about planning, let's take a look at some tools that I have, right? So when it comes to design, and this I'm just using the Mac here, but it's also available on PC, is something called WireframeSketcher, which is a Eclipse-based wireframing program, which allows you to create wireframes. You know, and again, there's a trial version as well as one you can buy. It helps you actually create wireframes. I'm not going to show you how to do that right now, but I'm showing you the tool, WireframeSketcher Studio. High-level wireframes, some cool tools you can use, and so on. So this is specifically for wireframing. Okay, let's get out of this. And then there's, oops, I meant to do this. And close. There we go. There's also, let's say, for example, the Adobe products. I'm going to go through that as well. So I'm not a designer, but I want to use Adobe products. I want to use Fireworks, right? And you're going to see me use Fireworks a lot. So in this particular case, I'm using CS6. And I'm really sad to say that Fireworks is not going to be carried forward into the Creative Cloud series of programs that Adobe is offering. They don't find that there's a place. I think there's a great place for Fireworks. I'm disappointed that they haven't really carried it forward in Creative Cloud. I know they say that later on they're going to come up with something else that's going to be Creative Cloud-esque for Fireworks. But Fireworks is almost like a scaled-down version of Photoshop that you can use to create your graphics with, and so on. You can also draw with it if you want to create a simple wireframe with this or any other program. If you want to use Photoshop as an example, that's another way to do it. And you just create a file, new as an example. I want to create, not that big. Let's say 640 by 480, if I can actually type. So here we go in Fireworks. So I can decide what kind of resolution I want and so on. Here's my screen, and then in there, if I want to create my wireframes, I just pick an object, like a rectangle, and I create my wireframes the way I want, right? And from here, I can create the way my application is going to look. I can, change the look. So here's another button. I can be very, very manual about it, but it really depends on what you really want to do, as an example, and you can create your form to make it look the way you want with wireframes. Okay, very simple, nothing too crazy. But let's say you don't want to do that. You don't have money for Fireworks, although you can, I believe, get a student version of CS6 through the library and so on. And it's not that expensive. Fireworks is a great tool. Let's say you want to use Paint or GIMP or whatever. There are a lot of other tools you can use, and I don't have a problem with you using any tool to do your wireframes. Just don't do a screen capture, because screen capture and wireframes are totally different. And why a wireframe? Why am I bringing it up here when we're doing planning? Because part of it, before you do anything, all right, you and I go into a cafe, we're talking about an app I want to create for my iPhone. What are we going to do? We're going to probably take a napkin and we're going to draw it out, right? And or something like that. So my recommendation is get to learn the understanding of what a wireframe looks like. I'm going to wireframe it with my pencil or my pen, and I'm going to label it right before I actually code anything. Why? Because I know what I want before I go. I'm not going to code as I go. That's just silly. It's experimental. I mean, sometimes you can come up with some really cool things on the fly too, right? But it's not really recommended. Okay, from a best practice perspective. So that's part of it. So we're talking about designing the user interface here. The other one is planning the properties. Well, I want to talk about what things I need for my app to, modify it from an app level perspective. I need to modify the variables or the properties of my object, right, and so on. I want to plan the C# code. I want to try and talk about that a little bit. Maybe do a little bit of pseudocode, right, which is like my app, when I click this button, it will open up the new screen. That's pseudocode. Okay. Talking about what it's going to do. It could be that simple. Please don't go into verbose detail, and don't write a book about what happens when you click a button for me. Okay, I don't need to know that, right? Very simple bullet form, at least basics of what you want your object to do, okay? Then there's the actual programming, right? So we're going to define the user interface with the program, right? We're going to set the properties and then we'll write the code. Very, very simple. So there's your 1, 2, 3 steps like we talked about in the beginning, okay? C# files. Wow, this was a real exercise for me. Capturing all the images for C# files. Well, there's the solution file, right? That is like the main thing that you need. You also need the SUO file. These are all files that are found, and I'm going to switch back here to, as we go to VMware Fusion. Hopefully, we're still going to be recording this. I don't know. Let's see what happens, right? It's still going to record my voice, even if this doesn't show up. We'll see what happens. Anyways, but at the end of the day, we're in Visual Studio here, and I want to look at the actual files. So where are the files located in Visual Studio? If I go to my PC, and this is a virtual machine, so bear with me, right? And I go to Documents, and I go to Visual Studio 2012, and inside Visual Studio 2012 I have another thing called Projects, and inside there I have a few different projects here that I've kind of launched for this course, right? And here's my Hello World project, which we're going to do today, right? And in there, there's going to be a couple files. I need, when you submit to me, I need this high-level folder here. Don't give me this. This is bad, okay? Don't give me the bin. I want, this level from here, all right? And this is where all the files for your project exist on your Windows system. Again, it could look different if you're using Windows 7. God forbid you're using Windows XP, right, or something else. I don't know if Visual Studio will run in Windows 2012 will run in Windows XP. Maybe it will with compatibility. I don't recommend it. But again, going back to here, again, what we're going to be doing is these are different files that you're going to find. And I'm not going to describe each file in detail, but one of the things you need to know is if I look at Form Designer, yes, I could modify the .cs files in a text editor. So let's say I hate Visual Studio. Yes, I could do it, but it would suck. Really bad, and it would not work properly. You're going to have lots of issues. And spin your wheels trying to figure out how to incorporate back into Visual Studio when it's just simple just to use Microsoft stuff. Okay? So don't try and be a hero, all right? Use Visual Studio, and hold on a second. I'm getting a call from space. I'm not going to answer it, though. All right. Right. Let's continue. They know I'm in class, but they call me anyway. Okay. Visual Studio 2012, the environment itself. So I recommend to you now, let's launch Visual Studio 2012 together. If you haven't done it yet, pull it up. I think it's about time. We've talked around it. We've danced around the subject a little bit about Visual Studio 2012. Again, you can use your PC in class, or you can use the PC in front of you, or the Mac with a VM, whatever you're going to do. Pull up Visual Studio for me. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. All right. So, again, let's talk about this idea of an integrated environment. What do we mean by that? Well, it has a bunch of different elements in there. We have a form designer, right? We have an editor for entering and modifying your code. We have the compiler, which we'll never probably use outside of clicking the play button, all right, in this course. The debugger, which we'll talk about. The object browser, which we're going to look at as well, and the help facility, which is just going to MSDN online, right? That's pretty much what it is in Visual Studio 2012 anyway. So let me shift back now to VMware Fusion. And just to make it simple, just to make sure that this isn't working, let me just go back for a second. We talked virtual machines, and just to ensure that you're going to get a good capture for this recording, I'm going to switch, right, now here's where I'm going to switch to. I'm going to switch to, instead of viewing it in full screen mode, like I have it right now, I'm going to view it in Unity mode. That's why, one of the reasons why I like VMware. I know Parallels can do the same thing, but in different ways. But I like Unity mode a lot, because Unity mode allows me to look at Visual Studio and just that. Okay, or if I want to look at my Windows Explorer, and it kind of brings up the window here on my Mac, right? So it kind of brings it all together, Unity mode. Okay, so hopefully we'll be able to do this, like actually record something and hear my voice and see what I'm doing instead of having full screen mode. Okay. So again, we're in Visual Studio, and let's start a new project. Okay, that's what I want you to do. So a new project, and we don't go further than this yet. Oh, by the way, when you install Visual Studio for the first time, you're going to get a request that says, "Hey, what do you want your defaults to be? Do you want it to be C#? Do you want it to be VB, for God's sake? No. Do you want it to be C++? What is it you want to start off with?" A recommendation is you do C#. Obviously, since we're going to do C# in this course, right? So it's going to ask you that question when you first install Visual Studio 2012, right? So hopefully your machine in front of you, if you're using the school machine, has already got that as a standard. All that does is it starts off with this menu here, right? So it's where it says Visual Studio, Visual C#, and it gives you kind of this submenu. If you expand the arrow here, it gives you the menu of what you want to do. If I click on Windows, this is where we have a chance to do either a Windows Form application or a WPF application or whatever. Or again, we're not going to be working too much with console or WPF. We're not creating a class library or anything else underneath here. The only sole thing we're going to be doing mostly in this course is this Windows Form application, because each of the other sections, I'll be honest with you, can almost take a full course to learn. They're that robust. Now, some of them you might not take that long. Like console application, you can do pretty quick and dirty, right? But we probably don't have a lot of call for that these days. How many people make a console application for Windows 8, right? Not many, unless you're going to do some kind of debugging, right? So not a lot of call for that these days, right? So that's why we're not going to focus on that. Same thing with WPF. It's a little tricky, and it's not as rapid as doing a Windows Form application. That's why we're working with Windows Forms. Okay, so that's the first part. The other thing to notice is on the bottom of the form, and we'll go into more detail about this later, if you notice, the bottom of the form includes the name, location, the solution name, and so on. These are all things that are included in the form, right? Again, you could change the location of where your project exists. Mine goes into users, Tom, my name, documents, Visual Studio 2012 projects. You could change to whatever you like, right? At school, I think it might go default to your student drive somewhere. I don't recommend that you do that though for your projects, because your student drive will fill up pretty quick with Visual Studio 2012 stuff. They're big. They're not like small files, right? So you may want to bring yourself a little stick along with you, or if you're doing it on your laptop, you're not going to have an issue. And by the way, when it comes to laptops and environment, I recommend that you do your programming on your laptop and not on the school computer. Not because I don't think the school computers are cool, but I think you have way more control on your laptop, and you're not going to need to reset all your configuration settings and so on that you may have to do on the school machine. Okay, so here we are. I want to create a Windows Form application. Let's just leave it the default for now. We're going to create another one later. So I click OK, and it spins its wheel in the background, Windows 2012, Windows Studio, and I've got this form, right? So if you notice here in Visual Studio 2012, I've got a form application. I can't really drag and drop this thing. This is just my canvas, if you will, where I'm going to drag and drop controls, right? The controls, and sometimes you might see them like the toolbox may not be pinned like I have it. It might be like this. That's okay. I like my toolbox being pinned up, so I pin it, right, so that I always see my toolbox, because that's the thing I use all the time. I drag and drop controls from my toolbox, right? Now you can set up your environment the way you like, but I like it like this. I like it so that I have my errors under here. I would have my properties here, and on the top right, let's move this little thing. On the top right, I have my Solutions Explorer up here that kind of details the elements of the pieces of my application. All right, this is the environment. My form itself right now does nothing, but it does run because my form is an object itself, right? And if I click the Start button here, right, it's going to launch my form. Here's my app. Look. And now it's a little bit slow because I'm doing it in a virtual machine, and I'm doing it in Unity mode on a Mac. But at the end of the day, that's what it does. It just launches this little form here, and it doesn't do anything except for it has the a standard toolbar on the top. Here's the toolbar right here with a minimize, a maximize, and a close tool, right? All these things actually respond to my different mouse events. They're built in. So there's nothing for me to program to make this work. It's a press play and go kind of environment, which is kind of cool actually, because again, we're talking rapid application development here, right? So we're not programming Windows from scratch. Okay, we're not doing that here. So if I close it, again, it returns me from runtime mode, which you just saw, back into design time mode. And this is where we are right now. Okay, so again, without doing anything, if I press play, this button up here, right, that's what I call play or start, it'll compile, build and compile your application and launch it if it can, if there's no errors. Okay, so that's really the environment that we're working in right now. Let me shift back to, and I encourage you before we do anything else, as I'm talking, right, so I'm going to be droning in your ear. You can watch this later, right? Play with it. Start dragging and dropping some tools on there, man. Put some buttons in there. See what happens. Yeah.
No, I can do it. It's fine.
You what?
What's the difference between the form and the WPF?
It's a good question. The difference is there's a lot more control that you have on the WPF side from a style sheet perspective and everything else. The form is like creating a standard window, and you actually create absolute controls everywhere on the form. On the WPF side, the design of the WPF forms are a lot different. They look cooler, right? But there's a lot more involved, right? And they're the same thing, really. They're the same kind of functionality. But in order for you to get the stuff that you want, functionality that you want for this course, that's what I recommend. And again, if you can Google it to see the difference, the level of detail you're going to have to go into for a WPF application compared to a regular application is a little bit more, right? And so instead of confusing you all with that extra level of detail, we kind of made it from a design perspective to stick with the regular Windows Forms application. Okay? Hopefully that answers your question. All right. So let's take a look at, let's say your default environment settings are not C# somehow, or you chose VB for some reason, right? Well, the way you can do that, if you want to shift back to whatever environment you want, right? You can do that by, if I go back to Visual Studio here, and I believe if I go to Tools, Import and Export Settings, and if I pick up, if I choose Reset All Settings, and I click Next, it's going to give me that, if I click No here, it says, you want to save my settings? I say no. I want to just reset everything and click Next. It's going to bring up the screen. So I can actually select what my applications will start with. The environment will be set to this situation right here. Right? Whatever I decide here, if I want C# or if I want C++, whatever, I can shift my Visual Studio to work in a different environment. Right? So at work, let's say you're working with VB, and that's fine. You want to use your laptop with VB, you can just use this reset and shift into VB. Okay, I'm not going to do that right now because I like my settings, right? All right. So the initial screen, again, it gives you exactly what we saw. We kind of saw that already. It gives you the ability to start a new application. The other thing is, and I'm just going to go back to Visual Studio for a second. If I close out my program, I haven't done anything here, right? I just kind of created a standard app. And again, if I close this out, so I'm going to go close solution. If you just close, if I just go close, it doesn't close the solution. The solution's still open over here. I can still launch it by double-clicking the form, right? For me to close out my my solution, I got to go close solution. Okay, and that actually closes down my project and puts it away, right? By the way, when you launch, if I actually click play when I have my project active, it saves automatically for you, right? So make changes, it saves. I recommend that you save all anyway as you go. And if you notice, if you screw things up, your project is screwed. There is no going back and undoing as easy as you think. All right. There are some stuff you can step back and so on, but that's why I recommend, and we're not going to teach it too much in this particular class, is some kind of form of version control, which actually Visual Studio is bundled with. You can also download Git tools for Visual Studio, which we'll talk about, or if you want to be really simple, and I think it's probably a good time to talk about it now, you can do it on your own. All right. So we're going to kind of take a break from the presentation for me to do that. And so instead of messing up this recording, we'll do it on the next video. Okay? So I'm going to break these videos up because already this thing is like 328 megs. And that's what I got to upload. All right? Okay, so let's go back to the presentation for a second. So again, if you notice, when I have this menu start off, it has different options, right? So here I'm closing it out. So I'm closing it down, I'm exiting. And let's say when I launch, I'm going back to my virtual machine. And if I want to launch Visual Studio again, it gives me this start screen. And it says I can start a new project, I can open up a project. It also gives me some recent projects I can look at. And Visual Studio is kind of cool for 2012 that it has how-to videos for like how to do stuff. So if you want to learn different things, it's all bundled within Microsoft. Microsoft's trying to make it so that it's the tool of your choice. They want you to build Microsoft applications because the more people build Microsoft apps, the more there's going to be demand for Windows. It's kind of like almost like a positive reinforcement environment where you build Windows for people who like Windows and they build more Windows, right? So and that's why they do a lot of so the good thing is they built in a lot of these how-to videos right here. You can also search for a lot of this stuff online if you don't know how to do it, or if I haven't explained it the way that works for you, right? Because everyone learns a little differently. Okay, so this is what you're going to see in the beginning. So we're going to go to the Hello World project, but before we go to the Hello World project, so we're actually going to do it, a new project called Hello World from scratch again, right? I'm going to pause the recording and then talk a little bit about Git.